Good morning and good afternoon to all who are joining us today for a discussion on the current protests in Iran. My name is Parsa Alirezaei, and I'm a research assistant at Simon Fraser University Center for Comparative Muslim Studies. I will be introducing and then moderating a discussion between Dr. Naghmeh Sohrabi and Dr. Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi. Dr. Sohrabi is the Charles Corky Goodman Professor of Middle East History and the Director for Research at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. She's the author of the book Taken for Wonder: 19th Century Travel Accounts from Iran to Europe, and numerous articles on Iranian history, politics, and culture. Dr. Sadeghi-Boroujerdi is lecturer, assistant professor in the International Relations of the Middle East in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews. He's the author of Revolution and Its Discontents: Political Thought and Reform in Iran, co-editor of Political Parties in the Middle East, and editor of the expanded edition of Fred Halliday's Iran, Dictatorship and Development. The current wave of unrest in Iran was triggered by a rapid and sudden decline of the value of the rial, the national currency of the Islamic Republic. The rapid depreciation of the rial, coupled with long-term high inflation, economic precarity, and social exhaustion due to a protracted state of siege that Iranians have had to endure as a consequence of government repression, corruption, and state violence on the one hand, and economic siege and war on the other, has left many Iranians with no choice yet again but to take to the streets and express their discontent, using all in their repertoire of contention, with the state reacting with what can only be described as an orgy of violence in just a few days that left thousands dead, creating a ladder of escalation between the state's security forces and protesters. The state response was not uniform, nor was it equal in character geographically or socially, but it has been effective in quelling the protests in the short term. While the protests began in Tehran's bazaar, a notable beginning, it quickly spread to the peripheralized geographies of Iran, from dwellings of the urban poor to provincial cities of minoritized nationalities. This rapid diffusion of protests was combined with agitation by Donald Trump, who signaled imminent strikes against the Iranian state if the protests were met with violence from the state. For many Iranians opposed to the Islamic Republic, this was viewed as a widening window of political opportunity to strike while the iron was hot. They were supported by the Iranian diaspora, whose politics has been increasingly centered around the former Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, both due to a loud monarchist current and desperation of the many. The government was not passive, however, fearing the developments and looking to recognize legitimate economic grievances of many Iranians. Their response, as has been the pattern of late for the Islamic Republic, was more economic surgery. This time, they looked to scrap the preferential exchange rate system that was a breeding ground for significant institutional corruption by rent seekers who had access to this rate. The government, from the get-go, was looking to label any protests that did not stick to economic grievances as foreign-backed agitation, illegitimate and therefore hostile to the state's existence. A pivotal moment in this political cycle was Pahlavi's call for protests to take place on January 8th and 9th, and many Kurdish political parties who also called for a general strike around the same time. The state responded to these protests by shutting down most avenues of communication inside Iran, with the internet and phone lines almost completely unavailable, especially its links with anyone outside Iran. This communication blackout has left many outside and inside Iran in the dark about the true scale of the protests and the subsequent death toll. Now, I would like to get the conversation started by posing a question to both Eskandar and Naghmeh. Eskandar can begin by responding, and then Naghmeh can respond. Now, are the current protests different in character from what we saw in 2022 with the Jina Mahsa uprising? If they are, how and why? Eskandar, could you expand on that, please? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, it's a difficult question. I mean, obviously, thank you very much for obviously for having us and for inviting us. And obviously, it's a difficult situation. And I should obviously add, I mean, I think maybe we all agree here that we have to sort of tread carefully, and we're trying our best to sort of make sense of, yeah, sort of was a very fast-moving situation, in which we can say where moral responsibility and political maybe lie, but actually kind of unpacking um, what transpired, how the different mechanisms at work is obviously extremely like a complex matter. And obviously, as people who kind of, I guess, study the region, we are, and obviously Iranians just generally trying to make sense of it. We feel this, we're often obliged to kind of offer these sort of neatly packaged sort of answers and, hot takes. But obviously, yeah, both the moral and political gravity of the situation always, in a sense, exceeds that. So I sort of just say that as a kind of a note of caution. But obviously, you laid out a very good sort of summary um, of kind of what happened. So I think obviously we have this idea that there was this initial sort of fiscal trigger. Obviously this needs to be situated in this longer term kind of just deterioration of the Iranian economy, um, the Iranian currency. I mean, any Iranian knows very well how you can go look on various apps and just follow, the exchange rate of the tuman to the dollar, and it's usually a quite sort of depressing thing to do. And obviously, this is something which Iranians follow very, very closely internally and without. But obviously, yeah, there was this fiscal trigger. But I mean, as we know, there's sort of these longer standing series of um, grievances. And obviously those are, very much within a specific like political and economic context. And this has sort of been ongoing since at least, 2012, but then I guess picking up again following the election of President Trump in his first term, the withdrawal from the JCPOA, and sort of the reimposition or sort of the prosecution of this maximum pressure campaign. So that's sort of one sort of, I guess, time scale. This is sort of getting, worse and worse and deteriorating ever more. And obviously, I guess the question is, how that has been interfacing with internal dynamics around, corruption, patronage, just chronic mismanagement, increasing sort of precarity at home, austerity, very much, outright sort of attacks very much on the working class. So this is sort of the longer, the sort of the bigger kind of context. Obviously, when we saw this, massive depreciation of the Iranian currency since June, um, this is obviously going to have very, very kind of consequential. And I think many of us who follow Iran closely, I'm sure many Iranians saw that a kind of an explosion of sorts was bound to happen sooner or later. It was just a matter of when, because I think all of us really kind of did understand that it wasn't sustainable. I mean, it was very clearly it was not a sustainable situation. And as you kind of said, I mean, the government initially set out to sort of placate, this kind of outrage, which, started in sort of amongst electronics vendors and then sort of went to the Grand Bazaar. But because of this sort of this, and this is why I was sort of laying out the bigger context, because there was sort of this bed or sort of ready for, all these sort of grievances, which were very much, on the, very much on the precipice of coming to the surface. This is why it very quickly kind of left Tehran and immediately went to provincial cities and towns and some places which I'm sure many people outside of Iran and some even within Iran wouldn't have heard of, like Malik Shahi and various other places. And this obviously speaks to this really kind of precipitous like increase in rural poverty and poverty in the peripheries and in the provinces, which is really marked and has been significant and sort of ongoing. And this really goes back to at least 2017, when you had the first sort of a major kind of nationwide sort of explosion, which started in Mashhad, and this was in the Rouhani period. So it has certain similarities actually with that 2017, 2018 kind of mobilization, which also did, I mean, it was slightly more muted, but also had very significant kind of anti-systemic kind of dynamics to it. Obviously, just to get to the heart of your question, because I don't want to prattle on for too long, but obviously the difference obviously with 2022 is that was again, there was a trigger, clear kind of cause, which was the killing of Masa Amini in detention by Gasht Ershad, so-called morality police. And that was, obviously, I think the question of poverty and so on, and sort of increased inequality was there. I mean, it was certainly present, but obviously far more significant and foregrounded in that particular mobilization was obviously the question of mandatory hijab, broader kind of traditionalist mores and norms, patriarchy, and sort of a social rebellion, really, again, and obviously it had a profoundly political dimension as well. The other thing, obviously, which was important was the role of obviously of national minorities in Iran, the question of kind of ethnic national oppression in Iran, which is obviously very, very real, and obviously how the question of gender and gender sort of emancipatory narratives around gender. Um, and the questions of ethnic oppression very much kind of obviously came together. And obviously, Kurdistan in Iran was very much a kind of a very significant site in that regard, right? And this is, this current mobilization is very distinct in that regard. And so far as the social question, the gender question is, less apparent, of course. I mean, it's really been revolving around political, sort of anti-systemic political demands, a form of kind of negative solidarity, which firmly kind of repudiates the Islamic Republic, of course, of which, its 40 years of rule are seen as, very much on a systemic level as having failed, and this speaks to a broader sort of a failure of governance, the ability to kind of obviously get the economy on the correct path, the ability to kind of institute profound, sort of deeper structural reforms towards democratization. So it is like they're both systemic crises, but obviously different sort of contradictions in the system are kind of more prominent in one case than another. But they really kind of, they both speak to a profound kind of well of deep discontent, which has been ongoing. And this is just to add as the last point. Obviously, it's a cumulative process, right? It's a cumulative process in which various different sort of social political issues come to the front in different kinds of mobilization. And these are both, politically distinct, but also geographically, there are different sort of accents in each case as well, which is worth thinking about so more thoughtfully. But anyway, so I'll be quiet now. And yeah, sorry, Naghmeh.
Uh, I want you to keep talking. Let me just add my thanks to what Eskandar said, and also say that I'm absolutely in agreement with him that we need to proceed in our analysis. Um, try to basically separate wishful thinking from what has happened and how much of what has happened we know, because as we know, communications hasn't completely opened up yet. Um, but I don't want to, I mean, I think Skandar did a fabulous job of kind of covering a whole bunch of stuff, a very wide range of things. I would just add a couple of things to what he said, in addition to what he said. In my mind, the most recent protests are actually two different protests. They're connected to each other, but they're two. There is the economic protest that started in December of 2025. And then there's the events of January, the two nights, the Thursday and the Friday. And I do think, for the purposes of us understanding what is going on in Iran and how these protests connect to what came before it, be it the Jina protests or anything before that, we do really need to say, okay, these two things had different rhythms, even though one fed into the other one. And I say that because even in terms of how the government reacted to the protests, it was very, very different reactions. And we need to ask ourselves, when the reaction of the government is very different between something that goes on from December 28th to January 9th, let's say, that's not a short period of time. That's quite a long period of time, versus the basically firing into crowds and killing thousands of people that happens over two nights. How did the government perceive each of these protests differently from each other? And some of the answer is already in what Eskandar laid out. And clearly the government saw the first set of protests as being economic protests, which fits into Parsa's, the introductory remarks you made about trying to fix it, even though there actually is no quick fix for it. And then on top of that, then people did answer the call of the monarchy, of not the monarchy, but of Reza Pahlavi, the self-described heir. And people did answer that call. Now, they answered the call for different reasons. It doesn't mean that they necessarily their thoughts are one to one with what is going on. But the truth is that on the anniversary, and this is very important because people keep missing this, on the anniversary of the IRGC shooting down the Ukrainian flight, that just remains on people's hearts 3 years. But that was the anniversary. That was the day in which the call went out for people to come out. People did come out. And that was then seen as an existential threat by the Islamic Republic versus another protest in the line of protests. Your question is about the Gina thing. I don't want to say too much, but just to say, I do think the interaction and the relationship between the Iranian population and the diaspora abroad, if you want to call it, that relationship was different in 2022 and until today. And 2022 and what happened in terms of diaspora politics, which when it exploded in 2022, many people were going around and saying, okay, this is separate from what is going on the ground. But what is going on the ground has its own dynamic, and what is happening in Georgetown and all of these things. In these 3 years, that relationship has changed. And I think that's a very important component of understanding what is going on in Iran today and what will be happening in the future that we have to take into consideration in comparison with 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2022.
Yeah, just to add, just a small point, which I thought that was really great, really important points. Something which I didn't maybe say explicitly was that, yeah, I think with the Jina uprising, there was in many ways a quite coherent kind of vision of like an alternative political and kind of social order, one that would sort of respect national, minorities in Iran, or at least and give them actually more channels for to be empowered and have a say in the way Iran is ruled, which obviously then has implications more broadly and ramifications for questions around just democracy in Iran more broadly, obviously, because if you empower, Iran's sort of ethnic national minorities, then automatically that's going to have implications for broader questions around civil rights and participation and so on and so forth, which is I think very structurally it's kind of a critique of the way in which kind of authoritarian governance has kind of operated in Iran, both in the Pahlavi period and subsequently under the Islamic Republic. So I think that's obviously notable. And obviously the question of women and women sort of leading those protests and very much demanding very much to sort of an egalitarian order, both politically, but also at the level of the family. So actually kind of also kind of worked on various different scales from like the national to actually the question of kind of the traditional patriarchal structure of the family in Iran. And obviously just, the deep kind of sea change and transformation in social and gender norms at a kind of a grassroots level, which obviously are contesting very much of the sort of, I guess, the rhetoric at the level and policy at the level of government. And whereas in this case, I think that's hardly clear. And I think obviously, as we said, it's anti-systemic repudiation of the Islamic Republic and like what it stands for. But it's, because of obviously years of, repression, very much the concerted effort to disorganize and fragment the opposition. And notwithstanding that, I mean, obviously, Iranian sort of civil society more broadly, but like, activist workers, human rights activists, etc., women's groups, various sort of Kurdish civil society groups have still very much kind of persisted, of course, and they exist, but not maybe they haven't been able to organize in really a coherent way to kind of cash out a clear vision of the kind of Iran that they would like. Obviously, we have lots of disparate kind of visions, but I think the reality of it is that we have it's quite a fragmented political scene. And what we're also seeing actually is an increased, I would say, kind of chauvinistic, kind of authoritarian kind of current and and kind of ethno-supremacist kind of current, potentially even. I mean, it has been remarked on by several people that it was quite notable that given the fact that sort of Kurdistan and Baluchistan were very important in 2022, that actually they were somewhat ambivalent in the first kind of phases of these sort of protests, where in other places where you were hearing sort of, I guess, pro-monarchist slogans. So there was a degree of ambivalence in how they should actually orient towards it, right? So I think, the fact that we are seeing a sort of an authoritarian, chauvinistic current. And also, I mean, there's also just this factor, I mean, just a question of political violence. I don't think we can kind of tiptoe around it either. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, obviously the primary responsibility lies with the government for obviously, brutally repressing and mass killing, basically, of protesters on the streets. And obviously, the picture varies very significantly. So you'll have areas, where there was, it's absolutely peaceful and just met with sheer sort of brutality. But I think it's increasingly clear that there was obviously the violence of the state, but also this was also met by violence in some areas by protesters. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that, right? The question is like, how do we understand that? How do we explain it? I think that's kind of the important one. So obviously one of the key reasons I think is obviously because the Islamic Republic has basically just shut down any kind of peaceful way in order to realize reform. So, I mean, if we go back to 2009 and we think about, for instance, the Green Movement, where people were marching in silence and it was basically calling for a new kind of constitutional settlement within Iran. There was some violence, but it was largely, just simply in response to the state violence. I mean, that was that. It's very different kind of. There's very much sort of emphasis on constitutionalism, on civics, on civil rights, and these sorts of things. And I remember at the time it was very much being analysed as a sort of Iranian civil rights movement. Today, though, I mean, I think that's very much a faint like memory for many in many cases, and I think we have to kind of take that kind of seriously and think about it. And we have to try to understand, obviously, why. And as I said, a lot of, overwhelmingly the responsibility for that resides with the Islamic Republic. And also just this sort of the everyday violence which that state has inflicted on people, in which, it bears the lion's share of responsibility, I would say, in part also for the defacing, and you could even say mutilation of a country's kind of political and civic culture. And I think that's sort of undeniable at this point. So, in a sense, and again, I'm not, not saying, we're saying this is a current amongst many other, currents, and we have to always remember that we can't ventriloquize for all Iranians and say Iranians think this. Iran, as we all know, is a very rich and very diverse kind of scene, but it has been changing and shifting, and I think we have to kind of look that kind of squarely in the eye as well.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Eskandar and Naghmeh. I think my second question actually follows up with your statements about the evolution of the type of protests that we've seen, the political culture inside Iran. A question I want to pose to the both of you, and maybe Eskandar, you can follow up with your remarks about the Green Movement. Why and how did political opposition to the ruling establishment in Iran evolve the way it did? From the 2009 Green Movement reformist paradigm that struggled within the framework of the Islamic Republic to the current protests today, dominated, I think, as all of us can recognize, very much by a loud monarchist voice that seeks to, from what I've heard, at least anecdotally, return to 1978, or at least what they mean by that is the pre-revolutionary period. Eskandar, maybe you can start, and then Naghmeh, I would love to hear from you on that as well.
Should Naghmeh, because I was just talking for a little bit, so I feel, I mean, I think Naghmeh should chip in, then I can kind of add anything if she's, is that okay? Or
Yeah,
Naghmeh, is that all
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I definitely want you to chip in because this is something that you've written about, and I always learn when you talk about it. I'll just give some just cursory remarks about, because you drew it to 2009. And I would say for me, when I think about how the political culture has changed, I think about three things, right? I think about how the political culture of the Iranian state has changed, how the political culture of the Iranian people who are politically active or not has changed, and then how the global political culture has changed. And the answer to your question resides in how these three things keep interacting and not interacting. I'm not saying anything deeply insightful when saying the year 2009, it was a very, very different global political culture than the world that we live in today. And Iran and its people and its opposition and its diaspora and its everybody is existing in this world today. I was thinking to myself when I was thinking about today's panel that how something very simple, right? 2009 was much closer to people, political scientists love to talk about the colored revolution, the fall of the, whatever, Berlin Wall, but these like global things that were people were holding up and say, oh, is the world moving towards a particular idea of liberation through mass protests, right? And then today we're living in a world in which, put Iran aside for a second, take United States, take anywhere, actually every part of the globe, there has been a turn towards particular types of right-wing politics. So the how and why of the change, to me, first and foremost, does lie in the fact that the world has changed and political culture globally has changed. So how has the politics of the state changed, right? I mean, I want to go back to something Eskandar, and I hope he talks about it more. But the Islamic Republic of Iran, people keep talking about, I'm like, people are like, oh, the mullahs, the ayatollahs, the mullahs, the ayatollahs. That's fine if you want to use it as a derogatory term. I won't stand in your way. But as an analytical term, that tells us nothing. And the reason it tells us nothing is that it does not contain within it the way in which the Islamic Republic of Iran has deeply changed since it was born, basically at the end of, let's say, 1979, when the Constitution there was a referendum on the Constitution, because it did play around with different ways of being, right? It was a very different kind of state, and it believed in a different kind of political culture in the 1980s. In the 1970s, post-Reconstruction and the beginning of the Rafsanjani period, it again started thinking differently about the intersection between economics and politics and social freedoms, which is an important part of this story also. And then you have, of course, the reform movement, and I hope Eskandar talks more about that. And one of the ways in which I think about it, I always tell my students, if you look at Article 1 of the Iranian Constitution, legitimacy lies both in the divine and in the people. Now, more often than not, the Islamic Republic of Iran has decided to give more legitimacy to the divine as a stand-in for top-down power. But in different periods of its time, it was like, oh, maybe we should, give a little bit more power, give a little bit more to that part of the DNA of the system. And it created what Naghmeh Sohrabi has called an improvisational polity. This goes back to, again, now the people. So the people in 1980s Iran to 1990s Iran to 2000s Iran were dealing with a different kind of state. And thus we're creating a different kind of political culture. And I think here the issue of generations becomes really, really important. Again, the Iranians who were existing in the repressive state of 1980s Iran were the generation that either did the revolution or immediately were born to that generation. Their understanding of what constitutes political culture is very, very different from a generation that is born within the current social media movement. It is not a matter of better or worse, but again, the question of how we got here is very important to remember, that we live in a world in Iran, outside of Iran, where the younger people's understanding of what constitutes political action is also different. And in the Iranian case, and it's the last thing I'll say before I give it to Eskandar, in the Iranian case, part of what has gone from 2009, which was a cry for political rights, right? Where is my vote? Is a demand for political rights, to the Women Life Freedom, which has politics within it, but it is a demand, obviously, for social freedoms. that sits on top of the demand for political freedoms because the Islamic Republic puts these two things together. That shift also has to do with how the priorities of different generations has also changed in reaction to the larger world and in reaction to the changing Islamic Republic of Iran.
No, I thought that was great. Yeah, no, I mean, it is thinking about how much the global political culture has changed is important. So if we go back to the late 90s when Mohammed Khatami was, elected with over 70% of the vote, and millions of people, voted for him. There was a deep kind of investment in the idea that, Iran had come out of, a revolution and an 8-year war, and just, the idea of, yet another upheaval, revolution upheaval was, probably more than many could bear, right? So there was very much an investment in the idea of gradualist change through the ballot box, right? And that obviously then dovetailed with a moment globally, this idea that, oh, if we pursue some degree of economic liberalization, which is something which happened in the previous under the I mean attempted and very kind of poorly executed and mismanaged and horrendously carried out, but like this idea, if we pursue privatization, economic liberalization, deregulation, so on and so forth, this will then lead inevitably to democratization, a democratic settlement. And this is obviously was an idea which not all, but some obviously reformists were wedded to and pursued. And I think those ideas were quite hegemonic, I mean, in the late 90s. And there was very much both, I would say, amongst the middle classes, a commitment to that kind of path, and also amongst reformists. Yeah, again, and I won't get into this how they became reformists, but reformists, let's say, Estatella elites. Um, and again, there were differences between them as well. But obviously, when that project, is, you have the closure of Salam, you have the repression of the student sort of protests of Hijda Atir, you have all of these in 1999, you have all of these moments whereby that sort of hope around gradualist sort of incremental reforms recedes further and further away and seems, an ever distant kind of possibility, right? And it's also in that same period where we see, famously following Hijda Atir, the Revolutionary Guard making this famous statements to the Khatami administration that unless you can basically get the house in order, then we are going to have to step in, which also then prefigured, the not only obviously the increased economic role of the Revolutionary Guard, but obviously the much more significant kind of political role. And I think a lot of us have always been concerned about is given Iran is both besieged from without, and then given the configuration of the political system in Iran, there's always this idea that the more the sort of the pressure is cranked up, the more likely you're going to see increased militarization. I think that's pretty much what we've seen and what we're going to continue to see, unfortunately. But yeah, obviously, then you have, in many ways, the reformist project, failing, for lack of a better word, or being perceived as a failure. It didn't achieve, these structural changes which were demanded. This is, probably, I guess, exemplified in Khatami withdrawing the famous twin bills, obviously one which was committed to actually kind of stripping the Guardian Council of its power to veto elections and so on. And then obviously that led to kind of a period of, I guess, political disenchantment and I guess a recoiling within, right? And a lot of depoliticization. And also, I mean, the reformist kind of neglect of exactly kind of, I would say, up to the social question, but also the economic kind of the political economy question to a large extent. That's also why they were in disbelief about how Ahmadinejad could have any votes at all. I mean, obviously, he was a populist, but I think there's no doubt that he was also tapping into, like all populists, I mean, just like Trump, like, tapping into genuine discontents and obviously economic grievance and these sorts of things. And then obviously how these are weaponized is important. And then I guess 2009 was, this really crucial moment where, it was sort of sliding doors kind of moment. Iran could have gone potentially um, two directions. And obviously, this is simplification. And you could argue that there's various reasons why it could never have, and this is exactly, and there were reasons why it ended up the way that it did. But, it's very much seen as a kind of, where Iran could have gone on a very different path. And I think, still there was hope around, where is my vote, which obviously was a much more, there was a deeper kind of political series of demands there, especially if you see how the movement evolved. And then, Mousavi's sort of Mansour, with this sort of his kind of manifesto, which was calling for kind of, again, a new constitutional settlement, political pluralism, all these sorts of things, which I think, any good liberal would say, okay, we can embrace that and get on board with that. Obviously, when that was, sort of snuffed out, and it's very clear that, Ayatollah Khamenei and a very significant part of the elite um, had made this kind of decision very clearly that this was just sort of a non-negotiable sort of alternative or option for Iran. And then what we've seen is, we saw obviously the Greenman, but then we also saw an attempt, obviously, after a further term of Ahmadinejad, with the Rouhani administration, to kind of be a halfway house, to sort of say, oh no, we're going to actually, we know the Iranian people are thirsty for greater engagement and détente with the United States and the wider world, and they don't want to have this sort of pariah state status, and they want to participate in the international community, all these sorts of things, right? But there's this halfway house that Rouhani can achieve greater economic prosperity, greater engagement and détente with the world, um, and have sort of a controlled opening up on the political front. And obviously, in a sense, all three were a failure. I mean, he wasn't able to kind of open on the political front, of course, because so he, one of it in the campaign in 2013, obviously one of the things that he was promising was to actually sort of try to get the Mehdi Karoubi and Mirza Mousavi released. That obviously didn't happen. But obviously, the big one was the initial achievements around the JCPOA, around which so much hope had actually kind of emerged. And I have probably little doubt that many of the people who came out into the streets when that was successfully concluded and were tooting their horns and were, overjoyed are now, well, the same people off in the streets in mid-January. But there was so much hope around that, and obviously when that became unstuck, this sort of middle alternative, this moderate sort of centre-right kind of alternative, which also attempts rather on the part of the system to kind of manage discontent, that also came profoundly unstuck as well. And I think people became very kind of quickly disillusioned. I mean, the reformists, the 1997 moment, it took a while for the disillusionment to set in, but I think it's quite startling that how quickly with the Rouhani government it really kind of set in very, very quickly. I think more and more people became convinced that actually the system is kind of unable to really manage its way out of this, what is effectively kind of an impasse, both domestically, economically, but also internationally. And obviously, we should say, I mean, this is not obviously all of their fault. I mean, obviously, who could predict? They didn't predict that Trump was going to come in. They didn't predict that Trump was then going to trash this deal, which was reached by the P5+1. You could say that maybe they should have thought about that possibility. But obviously, since then, I mean, it really has, the pressure both internally and without has intensified. And I guess, Pezeshkian is kind of a final attempt to try and manage this. And you can see it in terms of the rhetoric, right? So when obviously you had the Bazaar protests, there was this attempt, we need to listen to people's grievances, to listen to their demands. We can't, just meet them with repression, all these sorts of things. But it's clear that as soon as, as Naghmeh was saying, as soon as it was thought that there was a threat which was significant enough, immediately kind of, as is the usual way these things happen, the security state just takes over, and effectively the presidency becomes, is really kind of not really a significant player in this at all. And then, but he is kind of expected to do, I guess, the public relations management afterwards. So, I mean, and obviously I jumped over the whole Raisi period as well, which was an attempt by the government to sort of say, no, we're going to actually consolidate power in all of the branches of government. Because obviously, traditionally, often in Iran, we've had a reformist presidency. You've had the reformist or sort of moderate or pragmatist in the presidency, but you've always had obviously the security state, which is obviously sort of kept things in check and put in guardrails as they see it, right? The Raisi effort was an attempt to basically say, no, we're going to consolidate, but we're going to have a kind of much more authoritarian settlement in a way, but we're going to be potentially more competent. And obviously that did not happen either. So it seems all these different strategies, which I guess Ayatollah Khamenei and the security have tried, have really come unstuck. And obviously they've repressed other attempts to try to manage this. So the reformist one and structural reform. And therefore, you had disillusionment, but then disillusionment at the popular level very quickly can turn into rage and anger and resentment. And I think that's obviously, I think Naghmeh raised that really important point about the global moment. We're talking very much talking about the kind of politics of resentment. And I think, the politics of kind of desperation, anger, just really kind of just reaching the end of their rope. Like people can really just not take any more pressure, and that is obviously a situation where it's just ripe for social explosion, especially as the government is then trying to impose various kind of austerity measures at the same time. So it's a recipe for instability. And as I said, because of the sort of shutting down of all these avenues, which could have led to something more substantive, um, 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 this is why we are where we are, I think. Yeah.
Parsa, is it okay if I just add a couple of it's I don't want to take up too much time, but I just want to say that what's really rich about the question that you asked, but also makes it so hard to answer it, is that it does put you in a chicken and egg kind of situation of what is causing what to change. What are the pressures that coming onto the opposition? Is the opposition's nature changing for all the reasons that we discussed or not? So, and with that caveat, and with the understanding that I do know that the Iranian diaspora on social media are ripping each other apart over the question of, is it sanctions or is it repression of the state at this moment in time? And the answer, of course, is it's a chicken and egg question. It's the repression and the pressure of the sanctions. With that second caveat, I do want to just highlight without getting into, I think the other things that are important in this story is the kind of environmental crisis that Iran has been under that has changed from 2009, not to mention 79, all the way in. The external pressures of both the sanctions, and we now treat this as an everyday thing, but the June war, everybody thought the day that the United States and Israel attacks Iran, it's game over for the region, right? But it happened. This thing that everybody thought in their minds is never going to happen actually happened. Iran attacked Israel. Israel attacked Iran. The United States got involved. And yet, on the surface, nothing changed. And so, and that itself is yet another pressure. So, you do have, and it's really important to remember that after the June war, July was basically the most important story that came out of Iran is, are we going to run out of water? And you're going to run out of water because of the mismanagement of the state and because of all the external pressures. But something as fundamental as water was putting more and more pressure. So people are worried about their survival. Then it's just, are we going to basically die of thirst on top of everything else? And I say that it's really important because it almost, you look back on 2009 and you're like, it was not that it was a single issue protest. It wasn't. But it almost seems like the crystallizations of demands was different than it is today, in which everything falls under survival. All these memories of the past protests also come into it, but we're talking about, and I think it's reflected in the slogans that people on those two nights were shouting. Yes, some people were saying Jabi Cha, but the propensity of the slogans is freedom and death to dictator. It's like not asking for anything else because everything is being kind of pared down to the question of living, for lack of a better word.
Thank you, Naghmeh. Thank you, Eskandar. Eskandar, would you like to touch on that?
No, just I mean, I think it was great. I think it was really important. Like, addition. I mean, obviously, another factor I think compared to 2009 is that I still think there were elements within the country that didn't think that the Islamic Republic and its elite were kind of completely kind of irredeemable. Um, I think that's actually significant. There was still, I mean, some people probably will reject this idea, but I still think that there was a degree of kind of, I mean, trust, which I think 2009 really, I mean, the reformist era had already kind of had struck a blow at that, but I think like 2009 was really kind of significant. And I just remember it very vividly. I mean, it was like whole families were being torn apart over this thing. And also kind of the fact that it was, and this had happened, there was precedent, but I mean, a former prime minister and like a former parliamentary speaker were like put under house arrest along with their his wife. I mean, it really was a very significant kind of fracture within a cleavage within the political elite. But it was still like a sense that, oh no, Mousavi is kind of holding the line. And there's kind of a nobility in that, and we're going to compare him to the legacy of Mohammed Mossadegh, and he's under house arrest for like over a decade. There was still some sense that there were people in the system who wanted to kind of put it on the right path. Potentially, but then they were being thwarted by other elements within um, the system. Whereas I think now, I mean, because of also we have to just look at like the really like massive spike in inequality in the country, and it just speaks to exactly this factor that Naghmeh was pointing to. I mean, I don't really understand this necessity to say, oh, it's. I mean, I understand why people do it because they want to make a political point, but it's like, oh, it's definitely internal. Oh no, it's definitely external. And it's like, well, no, obviously it's not. I mean, obviously we have to look at actually specifically how they interact, and how they actually how this interaction in certain concrete cases makes certain outcomes more likely and certain less likely. So, I mean, this is how we need to kind of think about it in a kind of a concrete way, just sort of making declarative statements in this regard. I don't think it helps us understand anything actually. But very clearly they do interact. I mean, it's well known in the sanctions literature how they create, they exacerbate the situation around black markets, around smuggling, around all, which is obviously going to favor corrupt patrimonial clientelistic networks, right? Which is also going to increase like levels of inequality in the country. I mean, and this is obviously well known from just for the case of Iraq. I mean, the degree to which it massively empowered the Ba'athist regime, or like Saddam Hussein's clique and his and those in his inner circle, and was devastating to Iraqi civil society. And again, we have to think like, obviously in Iran, we think we're exceptional. Iraq had, historically one of the great, one of the biggest communist parties. It had like a thriving intellectual and artistic community. I mean, if you look at Baghdad in the 50s and 60s, I mean, it was a profoundly rich society which was destroyed, and it was like ripped to shreds. I mean, and obviously it's not just an external criticism, it's also down to obviously the leaders in their hand and the responsibility which they bear for that. But it's we need to kind of understand that. I think that's kind of absolutely crucial. So we just get back to the key point that I was saying is that, yeah, I think as a result of this massive increase of inequality and corruption and mismanagement and so on, and obviously just the situation of desperation, which obviously Naghmeh raised. I mean, just this question of survival, the fact that people can't, or even struggling to buy basics like bread. I mean, and it's not just this. I mean, this is like this is an assault on people's dignity, and people in Iran, they have pride. They have self-respect. I mean. And that is enough to really just set people force them to reach this point where they can't tolerate it anymore. But yeah, but the key point is just, I just think at the minute, given this corruption, there's just and complete like disillusionment and rejection of the elite as beyond redeemable. That's a difference as well. Which I think is newish. Like obviously, there's always been people who detest the Islamic Republic. I mean, that's not news, right? I've always hated it for very good reason. But I think this broad kind of consent, like a kind of a, I don't say consensus, but like this really broad swath of opinion now, very significant. Is kind of new, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Eskandar. And I like the fact that you touch on the sort of exceptionalist narratives that pervade analyses about Iran, both from, like Iranians themselves and those who, are self-professed experts of Iran. But, it is, I think what this current wave of protests has also done is be a contest over interpretations of the past of Iran, where Iran is, how exceptional it is, how exceptional was the 1979 revolution. But it is really like also a challenge of the foundational element, a foundational element of the Islamic Republic, and that is the 1979 revolution itself. The 1979 revolution as the people's response to decades of Pahlavi tyranny, And what I want to ask is to what extent are these recent protests, like, reconstituting that contest over what are the origins of our current cataclysm? Is it, these sort of the transformation of our political cultures and in opposition, are like the current narratives that we're seeing about like, oh, is it an internal or external, or is it an endogenous or an exogenous factor, or is it, like the fact that, what I hear is like, oh, the leftists did a revolution, handed the country to the mullahs when we were going to be the Japan of West Asia. So what I want to pose to both of you, and I don't know who to pose it to exactly. You're both exemplary scholars when it comes to this. Um, how does the reinterpretation of the 1979 revolution feed into this sort of political culture that we're seeing today?
Uh, that was a lot in a question. Why don't I just like pick a piece and then Eskandar can pick another piece? Because I think in some ways your question has two different aspects to it, right? One is what is the role of 1979, both in the shaping of the protests, but also in our understanding of what these protests can mean. But the other question is how has the idea of the revolution changed? Or what do people think the revolution is? And I really like your question. And I'm sorry I'm spending a little like too much time like dissecting it, but I like the question because those two things are absolutely related, even as the answers are taking you in different directions. And it tells you about the moment that we're in because you can ask yourself and we should, which is like, why is it that every several years Iranians take the streets, and then on the outside, now that there's hashtags, there was hashtag Iran Revolution 2022 that was trending, now it's hashtag Iran Revolution 2026. So people keep, and this goes back, like I went and looked back on it, and like Slate magazine in the year 2003 asked me, is what's going on in Iran revolution? And back then I was younger and much less careful. And I was like, it's like as if it's written on Iranian foreheads, they have to constantly make a revolution. But revolution is the language with which we talk about mass, we talk about social and political movements that demand change, for lack of a better word. It's become our go-to when we're looking at it from inside, looking at it as analysts looking at Iran. Then, of course, revolution is used in foreign policy circles, or rather in policy circles, and I'm just borrowing something that Gary Sick said in 2003, which is for the neocons in the United States, for the longest time, saying what's happening in Iran is a revolution and wanting it to be a revolution and willing it to be a revolution was a way in which they could get regime change on the cheap, right? So if you kind of support people, and that has not changed, by the way, that just absolutely has not changed, because if you sit down and think about it as a foreign power, if you want change in Iran, the government, and let's say you have the best of intentions, you want to save the Iranian people, you have to sit down and say, okay, what am I going to do, right? What are the options that you have? Genuinely, what are the options that you have? You can say, I'm going to go bomb the bejesus out of the country, but is that going to lead to regime change? Right? You can't put troops on the ground. What are you going to do? Well, the answer could be, I'm going to support the Iranians who keep rising up in protest for different reasons, as we discussed. And then I'm going to get the regime change that I want. So the other meaning of the revolution, the why it's constantly discussed when we talk about Iran, is that it actually is a way to get what you want from an outside perspective without actually putting in the time and effort to think about what that means. But the weirdness of that situation, of course, I keep saying this. I don't know why no one is the monarchists are constantly calling for a revolution. And I find that to be, just from an intellectual perspective, rather interesting when the revolution is what put your crown prince in diaspora. And so revolution is also took the father out of power. Has made the son work hard or not to become a contender. And so weirdly, I mean, we are living in such strange times that the word revolution is being used by the people whose entire political thought is shaped in opposition to a revolution. And so this is why I was like, I want to take a little bit of time and just kind of untangle your question and think about all these different things that go into it when we say revolution. What does revolution mean? And all of that. I didn't really answer directly the question that you asked. So I will just maybe use one, I'll just say one more, 2 more minutes, and I can come back to it, which is from a perspective of a scholar of revolutions and specifically the 1979 revolution. This is very different. It's just very, very different. With the caveat that every revolution in this moment in the 21st century is different from 20th century revolutions. The concept of revolution has completely changed. And an easy example of that is that in the 20th century, the word revolution actually belonged to the left, as it was a concept that emerged out of leftist thought. If you read Khomeini and the historians and the people around him in the 1970s and into actually parts of 1980, they talk about what happened in Iran as the victory of Nehzat Imam Khomeini. The word revolution had just a different connotation. Eventually, it enters their lexicon and it is appropriated. But that is one of the big things that the Iranian Revolution did. It changed the meaning globally for who could make a revolution, what a revolution means. That idea just doesn't exist. It's not about Iran. The Arab people call Arab Spring. I don't want to call it that, but people talk about those as revolutions. People talk about the Syrian revolution. And you can see how by nature, qualitatively, we're talking about different things. This doesn't mean we can't call Syria a revolution, but just that to answer your question and wrap it up, even that word outside of Iran has completely changed, let alone within Iranian political thought and Iranian opposition and Iranians inside Iran. At this point, I think when people say revolution, they just say people go into the streets. They can't think of any other way of getting rid of this government. And that is going to be the revolution.
I think that was really important sort of points. I mean, just some observations. I mean, Naghmeh's, really, I would say the resident expert on the revolution and kind of thinking about it in ways which challenge a lot of the kind of conventional historiography as well, which I think is important. But I mean, just one point about it. I mean, I also find it very curious, this sort of proliferation of sort of talking about revolution. And I think the way they manage sort of monarchists anyway, again, not all, I don't want to, but my experience, I have many in my family, um, is that actually it is interesting. It is genuinely intellectually interesting insofar as they, on the one hand, yeah, so this is a revolution because obviously they want it to be that. So there is this element of wish fulfillment, right? And then they project all of their hopes and dreams onto it, and the people obviously who are putting their lives at risk in Iran itself. But they don't actually accept that a revolution happened in 1979. So I think they really don't. I mean, like they actually repudiate the idea there's a revolution. This is where, in a sense, this repudiation of the revolution is very much at home in our current moment where kind of paranoid conspiracy theories are so predominant. So obviously there kind of one kind of big theme is that actually no, it was a conspiracy. It was the British who basically conned Jimmy Carter. and then put the mullahs in. And if you know the famous saying, if you lift up a mullah's amameh, you're going to see made in Britain and all the, all this sort of crazy, this sort of stuff, right? Because they're actually not willing to contend with the reasons for why there was a revolution that happened and why the Pahlavi regime fell. I mean, they literally are not. Have you ever heard Reza? I mean, I've never heard Reza Pahlavi talk about actually. He just says, there were some problems, and that's it. But it was really, it was basically a conspiracy against, this great kind of leader, pretty much. I mean, that's the theory. So I don't know why actually the discourse of restoration hasn't had more sort of a currency. Perhaps, there's a very negligible chance it will ever happen. But I mean, maybe if one day they actually have power, then they'll start talking about restoration. They'll start comparing themselves to the glorious revolution of 1688. I mean, we'll find out. The other thing I would like to actually highlight, obviously a major, and this is from the standard historiography. I mean, a major difference with the present, obviously compared to the 1979 revolution, is that I mean, there's no doubt, and obviously there's lots of nuances and ways in which we can complicate this picture, but there's no doubt that really two of the pillars of traditional Iranian society, the ulama and the bazaar, were key in that social transformation, right, and mobilizing around. They, of course, were not the only actors. I mean, it goes without saying, there were intellectuals, there were oil workers, there were all these sorts of things, right? All very significant. The student movement abroad, but I think there's no doubt that there were these two major pillars. And again, not all of the clerics were of the same mind. There were significant differences there. Neither was the bazaar. But I think I think there's no getting away from that is a very important difference. Another really important difference, which I think is really important actually, is Iran's place in the world system in '79 compared to the present. So. In 1979, you still had, are you still there, Parsa? Hopefully, the Cold War was very much ongoing, right? And if you look, for instance, again at the historical work on the revolution, so by scholars like Gasirowski and various others, it's very clear, and other work that's been done on the Carter administration since. Um, there was really kind of a deep concern by people like Brzezinski and others that that given the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that actually instability in Iran was very, very kind of risky, and very dangerous geopolitically speaking. So there was actually like a real desire to actually stabilize Iran in 1979. And actually, I mean, the historical record kind of shows that the Americans actually, despite what the Islamic Republic's leaders thought at the time, um, the United States and the CIA, it had lots of kind of, it was working with lots of Iranian sort of forces. It was in touch with them. I mean, it was in contact with them, but it actually rebuffed many, many, many sort of attempts to reach out to the Americans to say, oh, we want you to sort of back us against the Islamic Republic. In these first years, I'm talking about sort of 79, 80, and so on, there was like, it was explicitly rebuffed by the US because the US was saying we're more interested in stability. We don't want, and obviously they thought that the religious forces were a counter potentially to the organized left from insinuating itself as well. So the key takeaway is that there was a move towards stabilization. Whereas today, I think it's the opposite. I actually think because of obviously decades of animosity between the Islamic Republic and the United States, and Iran sets itself explicitly against the United States and Israel, and really has committed itself to trying. It's in foreign policy. Its big commitment was obviously to try to drive the US out of the region, so out of West Asia or out of the Persian Gulf region. Um, the United States has far less incentive to actually see stability in Iran. I think this is a significant point. So, and also, I mean, even in the present, we want to compare it to what happened in Egypt, right? So you had the Arab uprisings, you had sort of the coming to power of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then you obviously had Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates basically supporting the military in order to basically participate in a process of authoritarian consolidation again, right, and quash that. But the move was there again towards stabilization because it's obviously an American ally. It's gets this big subsidy from the United States as part of the Camp David Accords. This peace agreement with the Israeli state. So again, there's a movement to stabilization. Whereas today in Iran, I think if you again the analogy or the comparison is Syria, right? I mean, there's much more incentives to do whatever you can and try to intervene if possible in order to create significant instability. And this is why, I mean, we should be profoundly skeptical that, I mean, apart from Trump just saying that if Iran does anything, he's going to wipe the country off the map, like literally using that expression. But apart from that, there are sort of, geopolitical drivers at work which militate against this idea that they're actually interested, let alone democracy, not forget democracy, stability, just basic stability in the country. Again, I don't want to say this is 100%. I mean, because for instance, I mean, obviously it's been speculated a lot that you could see a scenario potentially if Khamenei dies, or if there's a decapitation strategy pursued by the United States and they basically kill him, that there could be some kind of Venezuela style kind of coming to accommodation. But again, I think there's lots of reasons why that might not be the case actually, simply because obviously of the Israeli factor, and it's simply no, it's not the same. They don't have the same relationship to Venezuela, so I think there's lots of differences which we need to kind of be aware of. And it's again, we don't know what will happen. We are speculating, but it's just I think it's very perilous for those reasons that I try to kind of lay out.
Naghmeh, do you want to follow up with that, or should we? I think given the amount of time we have left, we could go straight to Q&A too.
I
But
think so
yeah.
because we only have 20 minutes left. So
Yeah. So I'm going to, for the audience, I'm going to enable the chat function for you guys, and that's where you can place your questions. And then I guess we can pick and choose which questions to answer given the amount of time we have left. So I'm just going to do that. I believe now everybody should have the ability to write in the chat. So please and type your questions in the chat, and I will be reading them out loud. Hope the chat function is working. It's working, great. So yeah, please enter your questions if you have any. If not, I still have some, and we can keep going, frankly.
we're two very persuasive people. So
Yeah. Okay. How about if you want to respond, Naghmeh, or if you want to continue on your, and then if there's a question that pops up after your response, we can take a look at that. Are you guys okay with that?
yeah, no, no, I mean, I think
Oh,
Eskandar kind of covered everything.
okay. So we have a question. To what extent do you feel monarchist sentiments inside Iran are a function of desperation at the status quo rather than ideological alignment? Who wants to deal with that bad boy?
Oh, I can start and Eskandar can pick up. Um, I think it's obviously very difficult to answer that question, even if we were inside Iran, because it's a question that goes into intention, and you can't know intention of a whole people. I will say that it has been increasing parallel to the developments that Iskandar and I have talked about moving from 2009, how 2009 to today is different in terms of protest and how these sentiments have kind of moved and become more crystallized around the sun, son, than before. And I think that's important because I remember, for example, during the reformist period in Iran in the late 1990s, people talked about the grandfather, which is Reza Shah, the founder of the Pahlavi period, in the sense of someone who had competence and he built the country. Iranians love to say he built the roads. So but his father and him, I mean, absolutely nobody mentioned him, was just not part of the political conversation. And over the past, let's say, 20 years or so, um, he has become more and more part of it. That would lead us to say, oh, it's just a function of desperation at the status quo, that he symbolizes anything but this. But I don't want to underestimate the idea of restoration, which Eskandar rightly brought up, as it being a sentiment for something versus just being a sentiment against something. Now, we can say it's a sentiment for something because there are no other alternatives that are presenting themselves in such a systematic and forced manner. And I think there would be much to that. Unfortunately, we don't have other examples of any other way of thinking outside of the country, that would allow us to compare and contrast it. And that's the last thing I'll say before I hand it to Iskandar, is that I think it's really important to remember that one of the reasons we can't also answer that question is that the internal voices of people who actually have sacrificed something. They have sacrificed their freedom. They have sacrificed the lives of the people around them. They have sacrificed their livelihood in terms of having to be forced to work for a living and then losing that livelihood. These are the journalists, the trade unionists, um, the feminists, all the various kinds of civil rights activists inside of Iran. They might also, if they were allowed to say something or have a platform or just be free to verbalize their voices, they might actually be able to compete with that discourse, but they don't. So we don't know. And that makes it very hard to answer the question of, is it desperation or is it something else?
No, I think that was great. I mean, the only thing I think saying it's desperation isn't really, it doesn't really tell us much about the sort of the onward trajectory. I mean, just because something emerges out of, desperation, doesn't mean it can't take on a political life of its own, right? I think that's really kind of important. I mean, you could argue that fascist movements were very much were responses to um, just economic turmoil, right, and all these sorts of things. But the political character of the movement still is going to emerge, and there are other, and take on a life of its own. And there are other kind of dynamics at work as well, which we need to kind of consider. And I also just think that monarchism, it taps into deep sort of currents within Iranian society, authoritarianism, like chauvinism, patriarchy. I mean, these aren't gone. I mean, these are like profoundly alive and well. And the Islamic Republic has also found the flames there as well. So, I mean, yeah, and kind of extreme forms of nationalism. I mean, you can also see almost like the Islamic Republic itself, in response to kind of various legitimacy crises, has kind of been fanning the flames of nationalism. I mean, and talking about Iran and Iraniyat and all these sorts of things. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise then that many Iranians maybe don't think that the Islamic Republic is the appropriate steward of that kind of legacy, right? And reviving all of this sort of Sasanian iconography and so on and so forth, right? So, I mean, the Islamic Republic was always going to kind of lose that battle, I kind of think, actually, as presenting itself as the guardian of that legacy potentially, and it's always kind of struggled to kind of hold that kind of balance between its Islamic identity and the Iranian and so on. So I think that's obviously of note. The other part of it, of course, which I don't want to belabor, but I think it is important. One is obviously, I think, first and foremost, as we've been saying, like the political context, the shutting down of alternatives, and so on and so forth. The other part is, this has been, there is a foreign engineering element of this, orchestrated. I mean, insofar as increasingly, obviously, is the Israeli influencing campaign, right? And this has been covered by Israeli publications like Haaretz and pushing, monarchist narratives and accounts. And obviously, Reza Pahlavi going to Israel, meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu twice, meeting with the information minister in Iran, then going to and liaising, and probably it seems very likely funding at least some of these sort of foreign-based news channels like Iran International and particularly Manoto. And Manoto, I guess, is a particularly interesting one because I think, and again, I don't want to overstate its significance, but I do think it is really of note that it has kind of rewritten the historical record in Iran, presenting the Pahlavi era as pretty much like this kind of golden age. I mean, but I see something else there as well. There is like this really ingenious thing that they have done, and I really think it is ingenious. They've managed to kind of present and give the impression that kind of the largesse, the wealth, the opulence, the kind of of the that was enjoyed by a few, by the elite in the Pahlavi era, was enjoyed by all in Iran. When previously, there's no doubt that the Pahlavi era achieved, significant leaps in development and so on. But there's also no doubt that there was massive rural poverty and deprivation and massive class cleavages and also corruption and so on. But it's managed to present this as something which belonged to all Iranians. And I think that is of note. And the other side of it, of course, is that Amanoto in particular started through culture. I mean, it started through basically cultures like, Gugush Academy and various other things like these, like the X Factor, Come Dine with Me, and these various shows. But then it gradually kind of became increasingly like politicized. But the thing which I think is interesting about it is that is sort of the everydayness in which people kind of get politicized in this way. It's kind of what people talk about how Fox News kind of radicalized boomers. So I do think like it's basically just people have their TVs on, right? And it's just there constantly on in the background. People are making their lunch, they're cleaning up the house, but it's there in the background. And in a sense, you get this slow, almost like glacial shift, I guess, in people's views, and that's obviously interacting with the domestic political situation in Iran, with the repression, with all these, with the deteriorating economic situation, and so on and so forth. So obviously, if the economy is in free fall, but then you see Iran in the 70s was just this haven. It was like the Dubai of the Middle East, basically. Of course, you're going to have this cognitive dissonance, right? And you're going to see that in that way. So, yeah, I think those are sort of particularly of note. And I do think it kind of resonates. I mean, the funny thing about the monarchist narrative is that it has a lot more in common with the Islamic Republic than they ever would admit. Like in terms of its form, it kind of wants a patriarchal leader, which is chosen by God. And this is kind of pretty much what we have in Iran, right, already. But it's the content which is the problem. They kind of want the one which is allied with the United States and Israel and is much more socially liberal, but politically potentially authoritarian, right? They don't want the Shiism, they don't want the Islamism, they don't want all of these sorts of things. But in terms of its form, there's kind of remarkable similarities.
Okay, thank you both. We have many questions now. It's hard to pick between them. All of them very dense. Uh, we could go by, or yeah, we should go by the order which they were presented. The second question that was posed is outside of Iran, both from diasporic voices as supporters, I hear a lot about regime change without any articulation of what is to happen to the people who currently support the Islamic Republic of Iran. This raises a concern that without any clear path for integration of current supporters of the state, and I assume this is people who are, functioning within the state apparatus, that they will be subject to retribution. Indeed, this is something that advocates of change shout about getting back at those who did wrong, a revenge narrative. Are you aware of any articulable positions in or outside of Iran that have outlined a position on this? Very, very dense question. Who wants to start? Take a crack at it.
Um, I will, because it'll allow me to talk about my latest obsession. So no and yes. Outside of Iran, it's a very good question, and I'll say in a second why. But outside of Iran, the only actually people who have articulated what is going to happen to former members of what was this to the people who currently support the IRI is the monarchists. And the reason I want to talk about this is that um, you can go to a website called Nufti Fund, and there the people, the new team around Reza Pahlavi have in English and in Persian, and there's slight differences between two, but in English and in Persian, you can download what they call the emergency phase document, but it's basically their idea for the transition. And this, I'm really excited to talk about this. And I'm really excited to talk about it for a simple reason, which is that one of the things that after the revolution, people love to keep saying is that, oh, we never read Khomeini's Hukumat Islami. We didn't know what was going to happen. Nobody read it. And somebody would always be like, I'm the only one who read it, and I knew what was going to happen. So here we are. This is a public document, and it behooves all of us to read it and to understand what is their vision for the future. And the vision is interesting. And I would just say everybody should go read it. But in it, they actually say that their plan is that they're going to make sure, again, I could be wrong. I don't want to just not completely reflect. A lot of thought has gone into this document. But the part that I do remember is that it said they're going to make sure that none of the neighbors take them. And so that none of they can find refuge in any other country. And also, there's going to be two referendums. One is going to be a referendum on the form of the government that will take its place, but the other referendum is going to be what to do with former members of the regime. I say that because Siamak Namazi has an excellent piece that came out a couple of days ago in the Middle East Institute, and he is one of the few people I've seen in analyses of these protests who raise the question, or not rather raise the point that part of what makes this current regime basically sees every protest now about its survival. And he says the comparison between this and 1979 does not hold for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons he points out it doesn't hold is that where people were going to go once the monarchy fell was never a question in 1979. They left the country. They went to Los Angeles or to Paris or to London or to various places. There is no sense of where people are going to go once the regime collapses because it is, quite rightly, a pariah state. But what that does is that creates this impression internally that anything, any change, the slightest amount of give is going to lead basically to their annihilation. And I think that there's a linkage definitely between the excellent question that was asked of who has come up with a plan. Well, one group has. And the future of the Islamic Republic and the protests within it.
Yeah, no, I won't add much. I just think that's probably, I mean, my sort of thinking is that this is really premature, basically. Sure, I think the government's base has been very much eroded, but I think this premature kind of talking about where this is kind of the fantasy of the opposition. I mean, every single time there's an uprising, Khamenei's on a plane to Venezuela apparently. Well, that option's gone, of course. So I think the reality is that the regime did actually mobilize a significant number of supporters after this. The reality is that it's a different kind of regime altogether. It's a regime that was actually, and there's very strong, political science literature on this, that regimes which are basically institutionalized in revolutions and then wars are fundamentally different in character from obviously a regime along the lines of the Pahlavi one. I mean, and you have basically individuals in the Revolutionary Guards who have never taken off their military uniforms. I mean, so I just don't think they're not going to. I mean, and especially given the rhetoric of the likes of pro-Pahlavi forces that I mean, really open. We're just going to murder all of you. I mean, of course, that's not a way for building or confidence for people to kind of, break with the system. I mean, it's actually it's antithetical to that, of course, right? I mean, even if you compare, I mean, Khomeini's own strategy, what did he say to the military? He says, "Brother, why are you killing your brother?" I mean, this was like a famous kind of expression in the revolution. It was sort of, people were tasked with all, people went and put flowers in the rifles of the conscripted armies sort of rifles and things like to sort of to disarm them, right? It's called what's called fraternization in the literature, right? So you had like a conscription army. Obviously, you had elite units, but you had a conscripted army on the streets for the most part. People actually who had come, who were based often rural, urban migrants or came from sort of the provinces, and were very much like the protesters. Whereas today, I don't want to say there's complete dissimilarity here, but that dynamic does not hold. And I think, especially given the toll, I mean, we don't know how many pro-government people were killed, um, but some say 500. We don't know. I mean, we don't really know conclusively, right? But that's literally a recipe for absolute political polarization and civil conflict because the government side they're going to have obviously they have power, But if the situation does deteriorate further and further, they're going to have their own list of grievances. They're not, there's going to be these dynamics which are pulling them further and further apart. I think it's really very kind of dangerous, unfortunately. And also, I mean, obviously, that the fact that Naghmeh added that these people have nowhere to go, of course, and that's obviously just compounds it further. But I think obviously the really thing is that these are very different regimes, and obviously as political violence escalates, the sort of the logic of like polarization and conflict become increase, of course, and deepen, as opposed to kind of reconciliation and a kind of a peace, and actually kind of like a negotiated transition. I mean, and let's be honest, I mean, the people who are saying that are very few, and one of the few who I want to definitely mention, who is a remarkable person, Parsa who obviously spoke on the BBC the other day. And this was somebody, for those who don't know, whose parents were like murdered by the Ministry of Intelligence in Iran. They were well-known kind of activists who go back to the days of Mohammad Mossadegh, and actually her father played a role in the provisional government following the revolution and so on. But her parents were killed in a really horrendous, graphic way by the Islamic Republic. And she herself was saying, we can't just continue this cycle of violence and vengefulness and so on, because I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true. I mean, it's just gonna keep reproducing itself, as will the trauma. And again, I think sometimes we shouldn't, trauma can be often overused, but I just think that you see obviously this grievance and trauma kind of this recrudescence and kind of reproduction and sort of again and again and again. And we're seeing that again. And obviously, the loudest voices, the most outspoken voices, are the ones who are calling for this kind of, vengeance, which I think we're not there yet. But we see it also the violence in the streets. As well, but there are like a significant number of people like Parsa Alirezaei, like many who obviously object to this and see the folly of it. Actually, they see its folly. But the problem is that, as we know, the loudest and brashest are the ones who are kind of pushing out and crowding out and trying to basically suppress, intimidate, and bully rival opinions. So that's kind of where we're at. And I think this is why it's important to kind of, for those of us who are outside, and yeah, to kind of obviously, with no illusions about the very much limitations of us as kind of academics and so on. But it is important to kind of to recognize that just because people are louder and brasher and more sort of obnoxious and so on, that there aren't many people who aren't very much on board with this and see the dangers that it presents.
Thank you, Eskandar. And I think on that note, I think we can end the session on that note. I think the powerful words of Parsa Alirezaei, many of us listened to carefully, very impactful for a lot of us. And it's really hard to find something that is sonically sound in midst of a lot of loud noise that is really disruptive and hard to organize around. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. I apologize to a lot of our audience members who asked questions that weren't able to be answered given our time constraints. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Naghmeh Sohrabi and Dr. Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi, for joining us today and like really helping us understand and navigate this current like treacherous information landscape. And hopefully this won't be the last of us kind of reflecting on this moment and hopefully building a sort of analytical framework for a better future for Iran and for all peoples around the world. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you to all the questions. And again,
Yeah.
Parsa, thank you so much. This was lovely.
Of
Yeah,
course.
And
thank you
thank you,
so much,
Eskandar.
Parsa, and thank you for everybody for coming. Really, obviously appreciate your time. We know how you're very busy, and just thanks for the great questions. Really, just apologies that we couldn't get to all of them. Sorry about that.
Bye, everyone.